Have you ever witnessed a moment when reality itself seemed to crack open, revealing something so unexpected that your mind struggles to process what you're seeing? Picture this: 300 hardened soldiers from the Valerian Defense Corps sat in complete, deathly silence as a woman they had all written off as weak stood calmly over a man whose agonized screams echoed across the concrete training arena. His arm hung at an angle that made even battle-tested veterans look away in disgust. But here's what made this moment truly terrifying. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't shaking with adrenaline. She wasn't even surprised. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Kira Ashford, though that wasn't really her name at all. For 12 grueling weeks, everyone at the Ironwall Military Academy had dismissed her as just another diversity recruit who would wash out before month's end. She was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person who seemed to disappear into the background of every formation. The other recruits barely bothered learning her name. The instructors treated her like dead weight. Even the mess hall staff seemed to look through her as if she wasn't really there. But standing in that pit, watching Lieutenant Commander Voss writhe in agony at her feet, every single person in those bleachers realized the same bone-chilling truth. They had been catastrophically wrong about who they were dealing with. From which corner of the world are you watching this story unfold today? If tales of quiet strength and hidden power resonate with you, you might want to stay for what comes next. Because what happened in that arena wasn't just about one broken arm. It was the explosive conclusion of an investigation that would expose a network of corruption, prevent multiple deaths, and reveal that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody bothers to notice. The sound came first. A sharp, clean crack that sliced through the afternoon heat like a rifle shot, instantly silencing 300 conversations. Then came the scream, raw and primal, the kind that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your survival instincts, making your stomach drop even if you've heard worse on deployment. In the center of the sand-filled combat pit, Voss knelt clutching his shattered arm, his face contorted in shock and agony that was almost impossible to witness. Standing exactly 2 measured steps behind him was Kira. Her breathing remained steady and controlled. Her hands hung loose at her sides with casual precision. She didn't look shocked by what had just happened. She didn't look angry or satisfied or afraid. She looked like someone who had done exactly what she intended to do, nothing more and nothing less. She looked like someone who had been waiting 12 weeks for precisely this moment, to understand how a seemingly ordinary recruit could generate this level of devastation with surgical precision. You have to go back to when the mountain fortress of Ironwall Academy was still an unfamiliar maze of corridors and training grounds. Back to when the faces in the barracks were still nameless and the hierarchy was still being established. Back to when Kira Ashford first arrived at what was supposedly the most elite military training program in the Northern Territories and became almost immediately invisible. The irony was suffocating. 300 of the military's finest had spent weeks training alongside someone they believed was struggling to keep up, someone they saw as a weak link who would inevitably break under pressure. They had watched her move through drills with unremarkable efficiency. They had seen her complete obstacle courses without fanfare. They had dismissed her steady, methodical approach as the desperate scrambling of someone barely hanging on. What they had actually been witnessing was a master class in operational camouflage by someone whose real job was far more dangerous than anything they could imagine. But here's the part that would haunt them for years afterward. She had been watching them too. Every cruel joke, every moment of hazing, every instance where the strong preyed upon the weak. She had cataloged it all with the patient precision of a predator studying its prey. While they saw a quiet recruit who kept to herself, she was actually documenting a pattern of behavior that had already resulted in 3 training deaths that everyone had written off as accidents. Everyone except Kira. The truth was about to explode across that arena like a concussion grenade, shattering assumptions and reputations with equal force. Admiral Reeves would soon stand before those 300 soldiers and speak a name that existed only in classified briefings and late-night conversations between operators who had seen too much. Phantom. The woman they had ignored, dismissed, and underestimated wasn't struggling to survive their training program. She was conducting a counterintelligence operation that would expose a network of systematic abuse and save lives that no one even realized were in danger. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated by people who should have known better, then you understand what drives someone to excellence in silence. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses as weak is actually the one strong enough to carry burdens that would crush everyone else in the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand what happened in that pit and why a single moment of violence would send shockwaves through the entire military establishment, we need to start at the beginning. We need to go back 12 weeks to a cold morning when Kira Ashford first walked through the gates of Ironwall Academy and began one of the most dangerous undercover operations of her career. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute vacuum that occurs when an entire worldview collapses in real time. 300 soldiers hardened by combat deployments and elite training sat motionless in the aluminum bleachers of the Ironwall combat arena. Their eyes were locked on a scene that defied everything they thought they understood about strength, capability, and the hierarchy they had spent 12 weeks constructing. Lieutenant Commander Voss, the man who had dominated every conversation, intimidated every rival, and commanded respect through sheer physical presence, now knelt in the sand like a broken statue. His screams had dissolved into whimpering gasps, his face drained of color, his entire identity as the apex predator of their training class shattered as completely as the bone in his arm. Standing over him was Kira Ashford, the woman they had collectively dismissed as background noise. For 12 weeks she had been the recruit everyone forgot to notice. Not because she was failing, but because she was so perfectly, deliberately unremarkable. She finished every run in the middle of the pack. She completed obstacle courses with adequate but unspectacular times. She answered questions with just enough competence to avoid attention, but never enough to stand out. She was the human equivalent of beige paint, present, functional, and utterly forgettable. The other recruits had categories for everyone. There were the obvious stars like Voss, who dominated through raw aggression and natural leadership. There were the technical specialists who excelled in specific areas. There were the strugglers who were obviously fighting just to survive each day. And then there was Kira, who seemed to exist in some undefined middle space that no one bothered to examine too closely. From which military base or corner of the world are you experiencing this story? If you've ever been underestimated, or if you believe that quiet strength deserves recognition, you'll want to hear what happens next, because what unfolded in that arena wasn't just about one moment of violence. It was the culmination of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation ever conducted within the walls of Ironwall Academy. The truth was that everyone, from the newest recruit to the most senior instructors, had been living inside a carefully constructed illusion. They thought they were observing a standard military training cycle. They believed they understood the power dynamics, the social hierarchy, the unspoken rules that governed their closed world. They had convinced themselves that the strongest voices belonged to the strongest people, and that dominance was the truest measure of capability. They were wrong about everything. Captain Torres, the Academy's senior instructor, stood frozen at the edge of the pit with his mouth slightly open. For 23 years, he had prided himself on his ability to read recruits, to identify the ones who would wash out and the ones who would become legends. He had written Kira off in the first week as someone who would quietly disappear before the program's end, another diversity recruit who lacked the fire necessary for elite military service. Watching her stand with perfect calm over Voss's broken form, Torres felt something he hadn't experienced since his first combat deployment. The disorienting realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood his environment. In the third row of bleachers, recruit Dane Matthews sat with his hands gripping the metal bench, so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He had barely spoken to Kira during their entire time at the academy. When he thought about her at all, it was usually in the context of wondering how someone so obviously out of place had managed to avoid washing out. She was quiet to the point of being antisocial, never participated in the informal gatherings that built unit cohesion, and seemed content to exist on the periphery of their shared experience. Now, staring at the controlled precision with which she had dismantled Voss, Matthews felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't a training accident or a moment of lucky desperation. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had been holding back capabilities that none of them could have imagined. The medical team was sprinting into the arena now, their boots kicking up sand as they rushed toward Voss. "Compound fracture of the ulna and radius," shouted Medic Chen as she dropped beside the injured man. "Completely severed. We need immediate surgical intervention." But Kira had already stepped back to give them room, her face showing no more emotion than if she had just completed a routine drill. She wasn't breathing hard. Her uniform wasn't even wrinkled. She stood at parade rest, hands clasped behind her back, waiting with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what would happen next. What would happen next would rewrite everything they thought they knew about their training program, their classmates, and the very nature of strength itself. Because Kira Ashford wasn't really Kira Ashford at all, and the quiet recruit they had ignored for 12 weeks was about to be revealed as something far more dangerous than any of them had ever encountered. The woman who had seemed so ordinary, so forgettable, so weak, had been operating on a level that none of them could comprehend. And in 30 seconds, when Admiral Reeves spoke her real designation into the stunned silence of that arena, 300 soldiers would finally understand that they had been sharing their training facility with a legend they were never supposed to meet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mountain air at 0500 hours carried a bite that could cut through regulation gear and settle into your bones. Recruit Kira Ashford felt it as she stepped off the transport vehicle that had brought her and 46 other hopefuls to the gates of Ironwall Academy. But the cold wasn't what made her pause. It was the fortress itself, a massive complex of concrete and steel carved into the mountainside like some ancient citadel, its towers disappearing into the low-hanging clouds that perpetually shrouded the northern territories. Ironwall Academy wasn't just another military training facility. It was the crucible where the Valerian Defense Corps forged its most elite operators, a place where legends were born and careers were ended with equal frequency. The statistics were brutal. Only 12% of recruits who entered these gates would emerge as certified Tier 1 operators. The rest would wash out, break down, or simply disappear into the administrative machinery that processed failure with mechanical efficiency. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness with her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, Kira looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, another hopeful recruit facing the most challenging 12 weeks of her life. Her paperwork listed her as a former logistics coordinator from the 3rd Supply Battalion, someone who had spent 3 years managing inventory in safe rear echelon positions before deciding to attempt special operations selection. Her fitness scores were adequate but not exceptional. Her psychological evaluations suggested determination mixed with naivety about what lay ahead. Everything about her file screamed average, with just enough rough edges to make the story believable, which was precisely the point. The reality was that Kira had never served in the 3rd Supply Battalion. She had never managed inventory or worked in logistics. The person walking through those gates wasn't even named Kira Ashford, though she had been living that identity so completely for the past 6 months that sometimes she almost forgot who she really was underneath the carefully constructed persona. But that forgetting was part of the job, part of what made her so effective at what she actually did. And what she actually did was solve problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Problems like the 3 training accidents that had occurred at Ironwall Academy over the past 18 months, all involving recruits who had filed complaints about harassment before their deaths. The transport vehicle rumbled away into the darkness, leaving 47 recruits standing in formation on the Academy's main parade ground. Overhead, lighting cast harsh shadows across faces that ranged from confident to terrified, each person processing their arrival in their own way. Some bounced on the balls of their feet, burning off nervous energy. Others stood perfectly still, already trying to project the kind of disciplined calm they believed the instructors wanted to see. Kira positioned herself in the 3rd rank, exactly where someone of her supposed background would naturally fall. Not in front where the obvious leaders gravitated, not in back where the uncertain hid, but in that anonymous middle space where competent but unremarkable people existed. She had studied the psychology of group dynamics extensively, understood how social hierarchies formed, and knew exactly how to position herself to avoid unwanted attention. Chief Instructor Captain Torres emerged from the administrative building at exactly 05:15 hours, his boots clicking against the concrete with metronomic precision. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh environments. His eyes moved across the formation with predatory assessment, cataloging weaknesses and potential strengths, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen thousands of recruits pass through these gates. "Welcome to Ironwall Academy," Torres announced, his voice carrying easily across the formation without being raised. "For the next 12 weeks, this facility will be your entire world. Some of you think you know what that means. You're wrong. Some of you believe you're ready for what comes next. You're not. And some of you are already planning your victory speeches for graduation day. Save your breath. You probably won't be here long enough to need them." He began walking the formation, stopping occasionally to examine individual recruits more closely. When he paused in front of a massive recruit named Hayes, who stood in the front rank, Torres nodded approvingly. Former infantry, 2 combat deployments, outstanding physical fitness scores. He moved on to a woman named Rodriguez, combat engineer, explosive ordnance disposal specialist, impressive technical qualifications. When Torres reached Kira, he barely paused. His eyes flicked over her file, took in her unremarkable appearance, and moved on without comment. She was exactly what her paperwork suggested: forgettable logistics personnel trying to punch above her weight class, not worth more than a passing glance. Which was perfect. The first week at Ironwall was designed to establish baseline capabilities while beginning the psychological pressure that would separate the committed from the merely curious. Days began at 04:30 with physical training that pushed every recruit to their limits. Obstacle courses, endurance runs, combat conditioning, every exercise calibrated to identify weaknesses and exploit them until they broke or adapted. Kira moved through it all with careful mediocrity. She finished runs in the middle of the pack, her times good enough to avoid remedial training, but never exceptional enough to draw praise. She completed obstacle courses with steady competence, never failing but never dominating. She participated in combat drills with adequate skill, making just enough mistakes to seem human while never appearing incompetent. It was a masterful performance that required constant calculation. Every movement had to be precisely calibrated to maintain her cover while gathering the intelligence she needed. Too much success would expose capabilities she wasn't supposed to possess. Too much failure would result in washout and mission termination. She had to exist in that narrow band between excellence and inadequacy, invisible by design. The other recruits began forming social bonds almost immediately, the natural human tendency to seek alliance and support in hostile environments. But Kira remained on the periphery, friendly enough to avoid being labeled antisocial, but distant enough to prevent deep connections that might compromise her mission. She ate meals alone, studied alone, and spent her limited free time maintaining equipment with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that suggested someone trying very hard to prove they belonged. Meanwhile, she watched. Every interaction, every developing rivalry, every emerging leader and potential victim, all of it went into the mental files she maintained with photographic precision. She identified the formal power structure represented by the instructors and senior staff. But more importantly, she began mapping the informal hierarchies that were emerging among the recruits themselves. And that was where she first noticed Lieutenant Commander Voss. He had arrived at Ironwall with an impressive service record and the kind of natural charisma that made other recruits gravitate toward him. He was physically imposing, tactically sound, and possessed the sort of confident leadership presence that instructors noticed and approved of. Within days, he had established himself as the unofficial leader of their training class, the voice others listened to when official guidance wasn't available. But Kira noticed things others missed. The way Voss's encouragement always came with subtle put-downs. How his leadership style involved making others feel smaller to make himself feel larger. The pattern of jokes and comments that gradually isolated certain recruits while strengthening his inner circle. She also noticed how those isolation tactics seemed to focus on specific types of people, the ones who were struggling physically, the ones who lacked strong social connections, the ones who couldn't effectively fight back against psychological pressure. It was subtle enough that most people interpreted it as natural selection, the strong rising while the weak fell away. But Kira had seen this pattern before, and she knew where it led. 3 recruits had died at Ironwall Academy in the past 18 months, all ruled training accidents, all involving individuals who had filed complaints about harassment shortly before their deaths. And now she was watching the same dynamics play out again, orchestrated by someone who had learned to weaponize leadership and camaraderie. By the end of her first week, Kira had identified her primary target and begun the patient work of documenting his methods. She had also received confirmation through secure channels that her real mission parameters remained unchanged. Observe, document, prevent additional casualties, and maintain operational security until the threat could be neutralized. What she couldn't have predicted was how personal this mission would become, or how the boy named Recruit Flynn, quiet, struggling, already showing signs of the isolation tactics that had preceded the previous deaths, would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and preventing another tragedy. But that choice was still weeks away. For now, she was just Kira Ashford, unremarkable logistics specialist, trying to prove herself worthy of elite status. Just another face in formation, barely worth noticing, exactly as it needed to be. In the pre-dawn darkness of her second week at Ironwall Academy, Kira Ashford moved through her morning routine with the kind of mechanical precision that had become second nature. 04:15 hours, wake without an alarm. 04:20 hours, dress in regulation physical training gear. 04:25 hours, quick equipment check and personal hygiene. 04:30 hours, formation for morning PT. To anyone observing, she appeared to be just another recruit, struggling to adapt to the relentless schedule and physical demands. Her movements were efficient but not fluid, competent but not graceful. She fumbled occasionally with her gear, took slightly longer than necessary to complete simple tasks, and maintained the kind of focused concentration that suggested someone working very hard just to keep up. It was a carefully constructed performance that required constant attention to detail. Every gesture had to reinforce the image of Kira Ashford, former logistics coordinator, pushing herself to meet standards she had never encountered before. Too much competence would draw unwanted scrutiny from instructors who were specifically watching for recruits who didn't match their files. Too little would result in remedial training or washout, either of which would compromise her mission. The mess hall during breakfast was a study in emerging social dynamics. Tables filled according to invisible hierarchies that were becoming more defined each day. The natural leaders sat together, their conversations dominated by technical discussions and confident assessments of the training progression. The strugglers clustered at tables near the back, their voices quieter, their body language defensive. And scattered throughout were the individuals like Kira who seemed to exist in the spaces between groups, present but not quite belonging anywhere. She selected a table near the middle of the room, close enough to monitor conversations, but far enough from the center of activity to avoid drawing attention. Her breakfast was consumed with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else. Adequate nutrition intake, precise timing, minimal waste. She ate like someone who had learned to view food as fuel rather than pleasure, which was exactly the impression she wanted to create. 3 tables away, Lieutenant Commander Voss held court with his expanding circle of admirers. His voice carried easily across the room as he analyzed the previous day's training exercises, offering insights that demonstrate both tactical knowledge and natural leadership ability. Other recruits leaned in to catch his commentary, nodding along with his assessments, laughing at his jokes with just slightly more enthusiasm than the humor warranted. But Kira noticed the subtleties others missed. How Voss's analysis always included pointed criticism of recruits who weren't present to defend themselves. The way he used humor to reinforce social boundaries, making it clear who belonged in his inner circle and who didn't. Most tellingly, she observed how his attention focused on specific individuals who were already showing signs of stress or isolation. Recruit Flynn was one of them. Thomas Flynn was 19 years old, fresh from basic training, with the kind of earnest determination that made instructors either protective or predatory depending on their character. He had joined the program straight from infantry school, driven by stories his grandfather had told him about special operations during the border wars. His physical capabilities were adequate but not exceptional, and his tactical knowledge was limited by inexperience rather than inability. Under different circumstances, Flynn would have been exactly the kind of recruit who benefited from strong peer mentorship. He was coachable, dedicated, and possessed the kind of raw potential that could be developed into excellence given proper guidance. Instead, he was becoming isolated in ways that followed a pattern Kira recognized from the files of 3 dead recruits. It started with small exclusions, conversations that stopped when Flynn approached, invitations to informal study sessions that somehow didn't reach him, comments about his performance that were just harsh enough to undermine confidence without crossing the line into obvious harassment. Voss orchestrated it all with the kind of social intelligence that made him genuinely dangerous. During the morning's obstacle course training, Kira positioned herself where she could observe while maintaining her own cover. The course was designed to test individual capability while requiring team coordination, rope climbs that needed spotters, wall traverses that required boost assistance, mud crawls where falling behind affected entire formations. Flynn struggled with the rope climb, his technique inefficient and his upper body strength marginal. Under normal circumstances, other recruits would have offered advice or encouragement. Instead, Kira watched Voss orchestrate a systematic campaign of calculated indifference. Not overt sabotage that would be noticed by instructors, but the kind of social isolation that made struggling individuals feel completely alone in their failures. "Pick up the pace, Flynn," called Instructor Martinez from her observation position. "You're holding up the entire formation." Flynn redoubled his efforts, his face flushing with embarrassment and exertion. He made it halfway up the rope before his grip failed and he slid back down, landing hard in the sand below. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping and disoriented. Voss was the first to reach him, extending a hand to help him to his feet. To casual observation, it appeared to be exactly the kind of team support the instructors wanted to see. But Kira was close enough to hear what Voss said as he pulled Flynn upright. "Maybe you should consider if you really belong here," he said quietly, his voice pitched just for Flynn's ears. "Some people aren't cut out for this level of training. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." The words were delivered with false sympathy, designed to sound like genuine concern while actually undermining Flynn's confidence. It was psychological warfare disguised as mentorship, and Flynn was too inexperienced to recognize the manipulation for what it was. Kira filed the interaction away in her mental database, another data point in a pattern that was becoming clearer with each passing day. She also noted the other recruits' reactions, some uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, others nodding along with Voss's assessment, all of them learning through observation that challenging his authority carried social costs they weren't prepared to pay. During the afternoon's hand-to-hand combat training, the dynamics became even more pronounced. Recruits were paired for grappling exercises, with partners rotating every 15 minutes to ensure exposure to different fighting styles and body types. When Flynn was paired with members of Voss's inner circle, the training became noticeably more aggressive than with other partners. Again, nothing that would trigger instructor intervention, no obvious rules violations or safety concerns, just training that was conducted with slightly more force, held slightly longer, executed with just enough extra intensity to leave Flynn more battered and demoralized than necessary. Kira found herself paired with Flynn during the final rotation of the day. Up close, she could see the cumulative effect of 2 weeks under Voss's subtle campaign. Flynn's movements were tentative, defensive, his confidence eroded to the point where he was second-guessing every technique before attempting it. He was developing the kind of hesitancy that became self-fulfilling prophecy in combat situations. "Your stance is too wide," she observed quietly as they began the grappling sequence. "It's leaving you vulnerable to takedowns." Flynn adjusted his position, his expression grateful for what appeared to be genuine technical feedback. They worked through the prescribed techniques at a pace that allowed him to focus on form rather than just survival. And Kira noticed his movements becoming more confident as the session progressed. It was a small intervention, the kind of peer coaching that should have been happening naturally if the social environment hadn't been poisoned by Voss's influence. But it also represented a calculated risk for her mission. Too much involvement with Flynn could draw attention she couldn't afford, while too little might result in another training death that she was specifically positioned to prevent. After the training session ended and the recruits dispersed to evening personal time, Kira made her way to the Academy's small library. The space was rarely used except by recruits studying for written examinations, which made it ideal for her real purpose. In a corner alcove behind stacks of tactical manuals and military history, she pulled out a small notebook and began documenting the day's observations. The entries were coded, written in a personal shorthand that would appear to be study notes to casual observation, but they represented a comprehensive intelligence assessment of Voss's methods, his circle of influence, and the progressive isolation of potential victims. The pattern was unmistakable, and it was accelerating. 3 previous recruits had died at Ironwall Academy after following this exact trajectory. Equipment failures during high-risk training, accidents during night navigation exercises, medical emergencies during physical conditioning that weren't recognized quickly enough to prevent tragedy, all ruled accidental by investigators who hadn't understood the psychological preparation that made those accidents possible. Kira understood. She had seen this pattern before in other military environments, other training programs where toxic leadership created conditions for what appeared to be random tragedy. The victims were always the ones who had been systematically isolated, demoralized, and convinced they were failures before they died, in training accidents that were anything but accidental. As she completed her notes and prepared to return to the barracks, Kira allowed herself a moment to consider the personal cost of her mission. She was living a lie so complete that sometimes she forgot who she really was beneath the carefully constructed persona. She couldn't form genuine relationships because they would compromise her cover. She couldn't demonstrate her true capabilities because they would expose her mission. She existed in a state of constant performance, always watching, always calculating, always alone. But she also knew that her isolation was voluntary and temporary, while Flynn's was being imposed by predators who used social warfare to destroy people for their own psychological gratification. That difference made every sacrifice worthwhile, every moment of loneliness acceptable. Tomorrow she would continue being unremarkable Kira Ashford, struggling to keep up with training she was never really meant to complete. She would maintain her careful mediocrity while documenting the systematic destruction of a young recruit whose only crime was being vulnerable in an environment where vulnerability was treated as weakness rather than humanity, and she would begin planning for the moment when maintaining her cover became impossible, when preventing another death required revealing capabilities that no logistics coordinator should possess. That moment was coming sooner than she anticipated. The transformation of Lieutenant Commander Voss from respected leader to systematic predator didn't happen overnight. It unfolded with the kind of calculated precision that made it almost impossible to detect unless you knew exactly what to look for. By the 3rd week of training, his influence had spread through the recruit population like a carefully managed infection, creating networks of loyalty and fear that served his purposes while remaining invisible to the instructional staff. Kira observed it all with the detached fascination of a scientist studying a particularly virulent strain of social pathology. Voss had turned leadership into weaponized manipulation, using the very qualities that made him effective in legitimate contexts to create an environment where psychological torture masqueraded as team building. His methods were sophisticated enough to have been developed through extensive practice. He never targeted recruits randomly or acted from obvious personal animosity. Instead, he selected victims based on careful assessment of their vulnerabilities, social isolation, financial stress, family problems, or simple inexperience that made them easy to manipulate. Flynn possessed several of these characteristics, which explained why he had become Voss's primary focus. The morning formation on Tuesday of the third week provided a perfect example of how Voss operated. As recruits assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, Flynn arrived 30 seconds late due to a malfunctioning alarm clock. It was the kind of minor equipment failure that happened to everyone eventually, easily corrected and quickly forgotten under normal circumstances. But Voss had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. "Looks like some people think military time is just a suggestion," he announced loudly enough for the entire formation to hear. His tone carried just the right mixture of disappointment and concern, positioning himself as someone reluctantly forced to address a team member's failure. "When we're deployed, 30 seconds can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." The other recruits shifted uncomfortably, their eyes moving between Flynn and Voss with the kind of nervous attention that indicated they understood something significant was happening. Flynn's face flushed red, his humiliation visible even in the dim lighting. He opened his mouth to explain about the alarm malfunction, then closed it again, recognizing that any excuse would only make the situation worse. Captain Torres had witnessed the entire exchange, but from his perspective it appeared to be exactly the kind of peer accountability that the Academy wanted to foster. Voss had identified a problem, addressed it professionally, and reinforced standards that benefited the entire unit. The fact that his intervention had also publicly humiliated Flynn and strengthened his own position as the group's disciplinary authority was presented as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of leadership. This was the insidious genius of Voss's approach. He had weaponized the Academy's own values, turning legitimate military concepts like accountability, standards, and team cohesion into tools for psychological destruction. Every action he took could be justified through official doctrine, which made his behavior nearly impossible to challenge through normal channels. During the day's tactical training exercise, his methods became even more sophisticated. The scenario involved a simulated hostage rescue in an abandoned building complex, with recruits divided into assault teams that would be evaluated on speed, coordination, and mission effectiveness. As the informal leader of their training class, Voss naturally assumed overall command authority, positioning himself to control both the tactical plan and individual assignments. Flynn found himself assigned to a supporting role that kept him isolated from the primary action, while ensuring that any mistakes would be highly visible to evaluating instructors. When his team reached their designated position, they discovered that their communications equipment had been tampered with, subtle damage that rendered the radios functional but unreliable, creating exactly the kind of coordination failures that would reflect poorly on Flynn's leadership capabilities. Kira, positioned with a different assault team, had a clear view of the entire operation. She watched Voss's people execute their assignments flawlessly, while Flynn's team struggled with equipment failures and coordination problems that had been deliberately engineered. To the instructors observing from their monitoring positions, it appeared to be a clear demonstration of competence versus incompetence, natural selection in action. But Kira had seen Recruit Morrison tampering with Flynn's radio equipment during the pre-mission briefing. Morrison was one of Voss's most devoted followers, a former communications specialist who possessed both the technical knowledge and moral flexibility necessary to conduct sabotage operations. The damage had been inflicted with surgical precision, just enough to create problems without triggering equipment inspections that might reveal deliberate interference. After the exercise concluded, Voss conducted what appeared to be a professional after-action review. His analysis was tactically sound, his observations accurate, his recommendations constructive. He praised effective performance where appropriate and identified areas for improvement. With clinical objectivity, But his focus inevitably returned to Flynn's team and their coordination failures, analyzing their mistakes with the kind of detailed attention that ensured everyone present understood exactly who was responsible for the mission's shortcomings. Communication is the foundation of tactical success, Voss explained to the assembled recruits, his tone suggesting patient instruction rather than personal attack. When team members fail to maintain positive control of their equipment and procedures, they don't just compromise their own effectiveness, they endanger everyone who depends on them. Flynn sat in the back of the briefing room, his face a mask of barely controlled frustration and self-doubt. The equipment failures hadn't been his fault, but explaining that would sound like making excuses for poor performance. Voss's analysis was technically accurate, even if it ignored the sabotage that had created the problems in the first place, and everyone in the room was now looking at Flynn as someone who couldn't be trusted with critical responsibilities. That evening in the barracks, the social dynamics that Voss had been carefully cultivating reached a new level of sophistication. Instead of directly ostracizing Flynn, he organized informal study sessions and tactical discussions that somehow never included invitations for the struggling recruit. When Flynn approached groups engaged in these activities, conversations would gradually shift to topics where his limited experience made meaningful contribution impossible. It was social warfare conducted with the precision of a military operation. Flynn wasn't being actively excluded in ways that would trigger intervention from Academy staff. Instead, he was being systematically isolated through 1,000 small actions that cumulatively convinced him that his presence was unwelcome and his contributions were valued by no one. Kira watched it all from her carefully maintained position on the periphery. She participated just enough in group activities to avoid suspicion while documenting every aspect of Voss's campaign. Her notebook filled with coded observations about timing, participants, methods, and escalation patterns. The data painted a picture of psychological destruction that was both methodical and ruthless. What made it particularly dangerous was how it mirrored the documented experiences of the 3 recruits who had died during previous training cycles. Each had followed the same trajectory: initial targeting based on perceived weakness, progressive social isolation, systematic undermining of confidence and competence, and finally the kind of demoralization that made training accidents not just possible, but probable. The previous victims had died during high-stress training exercises when their degraded mental state made them more likely to make fatal mistakes. Equipment failures during rope work, navigation errors during night movements, panic responses during underwater training that prevented proper safety procedures, all ruled accidental by investigators who hadn't understood the psychological preparation that made those accidents virtually inevitable. Flynn was following the same path, and his deterioration was accelerating faster than the previous cases. Voss had refined his methods through practice, learning to apply psychological pressure more efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability. Where previous campaigns had taken months to reach crisis points, Flynn was showing severe stress indicators after only 3 weeks of systematic targeting. By Thursday evening, Kira had documented enough evidence to trigger a formal investigation if she revealed her true identity and mission parameters. But doing so would compromise not just her current operation, but potentially years of intelligence work that depended on maintaining her cover identity. The decision matrix was complex. Reveal herself to save one life, while potentially preventing future operations that could save many more, or maintain operational security while searching for alternative intervention methods. The calculus became even more complicated when she overheard Morrison and 2 other Voss loyalists discussing special training they had planned for Flynn during the upcoming weekend field exercise. Their conversation was deliberately vague, but the implications were clear enough. They were planning some form of direct action that would escalate beyond the psychological warfare they had been conducting. Kira understood that she was approaching a decision point that would define both Flynn's survival and her own future effectiveness as an operator. Every instinct developed through years of deep cover work argued for maintaining her position and finding subtle ways to protect Flynn without exposing her capabilities. But her experience with previous cases suggested that subtle interventions would be insufficient against opponents who had learned to weaponize the Academy's own systems against their victims. As she prepared for sleep that night, Kira made preliminary plans for multiple contingencies. She identified equipment caches where she could access resources not available to normal recruits. She reviewed escape and evasion routes in case mission compromise required immediate extraction. Most importantly, she began mental preparation for the possibility that saving Flynn's life would require revealing capabilities that would end her career as a deep cover operative. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years becoming invisible, learning to blend into any environment so completely that her real identity became almost mythical. But all that training and sacrifice might ultimately be worthless if the only way to prevent another training death was to step into the light and shatter the carefully constructed illusion that had made her so effective. The weekend field exercise was scheduled to begin in 48 hours, based on her analysis of Voss's escalation patterns and the planning discussions she had intercepted. That would likely be when Flynn's systematic destruction reached its culmination. She had 48 hours to find a solution that would save his life without destroying her ability to prevent future tragedies. 48 hours to decide who she really was beneath all the carefully constructed identities. The invisible guardian who worked in shadows, or the protector who stepped forward when shadows weren't enough. The subtle signs were everywhere once you knew how to read them, like cracks in a facade that revealed the structural damage beneath. Kira had spent her career learning to interpret the language of institutional decay, the way corruption and abuse created patterns that were invisible to casual observation but unmistakable to trained eyes. At Ironwall Academy, those patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. It started with small anomalies in the equipment logs, gear assignments that didn't match standard protocols, maintenance schedules that had been quietly altered, safety inspections that showed signatures from personnel who hadn't actually conducted the reviews. To most people, these would have appeared to be routine administrative errors, the kind of bureaucratic confusion that plagued every large organization. But Kira understood that in military environments, such errors rarely occurred randomly. Someone was manipulating the Academy's logistical systems with the kind of access that required either administrative privileges or collaboration from multiple staff members. The manipulation was subtle enough to avoid triggering automated oversight protocols, but systematic enough to suggest coordination and planning. Equipment was being moved, modified, and reassigned in ways that created predictable vulnerabilities during high-risk training exercises. Her investigation had begun as a standard intelligence collection operation, documenting social dynamics and individual behaviors for analysis by higher authorities. But the deeper she dug into the Academy's operational patterns, the more she realized that Voss's psychological warfare campaign was just the visible component of a much larger corruption network that had been operating for years. The 3 previous training deaths hadn't been the result of random accidents or even isolated incidents of harassment. They had been the culmination of systematic manipulation conducted by people who understood how to weaponize military training environments against their own personnel. Voss was a key player, but he wasn't operating alone, and he certainly wasn't the architect of something this sophisticated. During her 4th week at the academy, Kira finally identified the network's true scope when she discovered irregularities in the personnel files of several instructional staff members. Senior Instructor Walsh had arrived at Ironwall immediately after a previous assignment ended under circumstances that had never been fully investigated. Equipment Supervisor Rodriguez had access to maintenance systems that allowed him to create safety hazards that would appear accidental during post-incident analysis. Medical Officer Hendricks controlled the Academy's health monitoring systems, which gave him the ability to manipulate fitness evaluations and psychological assessments in ways that could predetermine training outcomes. Together, they formed a shadow command structure that operated within the Academy's legitimate hierarchy while pursuing objectives that had nothing to do with producing elite military operators. Instead, they were conducting what amounted to systematic murder, targeting recruits who met specific psychological profiles while maintaining plausible deniability through manufactured accidents. The revelation was both professionally satisfying and personally horrifying. Kira had solved the puzzle that 3 separate investigations had failed to crack, identifying not just the perpetrators but their methods and institutional support systems. But she had also discovered that Flynn wasn't just being targeted by one psychopathic leader. He was being hunted by a network of institutional predators who had turned military training into a laboratory for studying how to destroy human beings with scientific precision. The weekend field exercise that was scheduled to begin Friday evening would take recruits into the mountain wilderness surrounding Ironwall Academy for 72 hours of intensive training designed to simulate deployment conditions, navigation challenges, survival scenarios, tactical problems, and endurance tests would push everyone to their physical and mental limits, while being conducted in an environment where accidents could happen easily and investigation would be difficult. It was the perfect killing ground for people who had learned to make murder look accidental. Kira's intelligence analysis indicated that Flynn would be targeted during the exercise's most dangerous phase, a night navigation challenge that required recruits to traverse difficult terrain while carrying full equipment loads. The route passed through areas where equipment failures could easily result in fatal falls, where communication dead zones would prevent calls for assistance, and where rescue operations would be complicated by terrain and weather conditions. Her investigation had revealed that the 3 previous victims had all died during similar exercises, each following scenarios that had been carefully engineered to maximize danger while minimizing the possibility of intervention by legitimate authority figures. The corruption network had learned to use the Academy's own training protocols as weapons, turning legitimate military exercises into execution chambers. Wednesday evening brought confirmation of what Kira had suspected when she observed Equipment Supervisor Rodriguez conducting unauthorized modifications to Flynn's climbing gear. The changes were subtle: weakened carabiners that would fail under stress, rope damage that would become critical during extended use, harness adjustments that would compromise safety systems during fall arrest situations. To casual inspection, everything appeared normal. Under field conditions with full stress loads, the equipment would fail catastrophically. She documented everything with the kind of methodical precision that had made her legendary among intelligence professionals. Photographs, timestamps, technical specifications, chain of custody documentation, every piece of evidence that would be needed to prosecute the network once her mission was complete. But she also understood that prosecution was a future concern, while Flynn's survival was an immediate crisis that would be decided within the next 48 hours. Thursday brought the final piece of the puzzle when she intercepted communications between Walsh and an external contact who was obviously coordinating the network's activities from outside the academy. The conversation was conducted through coded language that would have been meaningless to most listeners, but Kira's training in signals intelligence allowed her to understand that Flynn's elimination had been specifically requested by someone with enough authority to direct the network's operations. The implications were staggering. Flynn wasn't being targeted because he was weak or vulnerable or simply unlucky enough to attract Voss's attention. He was being eliminated because someone outside Ironwall Academy wanted him dead, and they were using the corruption network as their weapon of choice. The systematic psychological destruction, the equipment sabotage, the careful planning for the weekend exercise, all of it was being orchestrated to satisfy an assassination contract, disguised as a training accident. That revelation fundamentally changed Kira's tactical situation. She wasn't just trying to prevent workplace harassment or even institutional corruption. She was trying to stop a murder that was being conducted with government resources and official cover. The stakes were higher than she had realized, and the time for subtle intervention was rapidly running out. Her secure communication protocols allowed her to contact her handlers and request guidance, but the response time would be measured in days rather than hours. By the time higher authorities could analyze the situation and provide direction, Flynn would already be dead. The decision about whether to maintain operational security or prevent an assassination would have to be made by her alone, based on her assessment of immediate tactical requirements. Friday morning brought final preparations for the weekend exercise, with recruits receiving equipment assignments, route briefings, and safety instructions that were designed to sound comprehensive while actually providing cover for the planned elimination. Kira watched Flynn receive his compromised gear with the kind of careful attention to detail that indicated he was trying very hard to avoid any mistakes that might provide additional ammunition for his critics. He had no idea that his climbing equipment had been systematically weakened, that his communication gear had been programmed to fail at critical moments, or that the route he would be following had been chosen specifically to maximize the lethality of those failures. He was walking into an execution chamber while believing he was participating in a training exercise that would help prove his worth as a potential special operations candidate. The final irony was that Flynn possessed exactly the kind of character traits that should have made him an ideal military operator. He was dedicated, courageous, and possessed the kind of moral foundation that prevented him from using others' weaknesses against them. Under different circumstances, with proper mentorship and support, he could have become exactly the kind of leader that military organizations desperately needed. Instead, he was going to die because those same qualities made him inconvenient to people who had learned to profit from corruption and institutional decay. His death would serve as both a specific elimination and a general warning to others who might consider challenging the network's control over academy operations. As evening formation approached and recruits prepared to depart for the wilderness exercise, Kira made her final decision. She had spent years learning to work in shadows, to solve problems without anyone knowing she had been involved. But some problems couldn't be solved through invisibility and patience. Some situations required someone to step into the light and accept the consequences of being seen. Flynn's life was worth more than her cover identity. It was worth more than her future effectiveness as a deep cover operative. It was worth more than years of careful preparation for missions that might never materialize. Tomorrow, when the network made their move against him, she would be ready to respond with capabilities they couldn't possibly anticipate. The quiet logistics coordinator who had spent a month being invisible was about to become very visible indeed. And when that happened, everyone involved would finally understand exactly what kind of mistake they had made in targeting someone under her protection. The weekend exercise would definitely end with someone's career being destroyed. But it wouldn't be Flynn's. The mountain air carried a different quality on Friday evening as the recruits prepared for departure, sharp with the promise of weather changes that would make the weekend exercise even more challenging than planned. 47 bodies moved through final equipment checks with the kind of focused intensity that came from knowing the next 72 hours would test every limit they possessed. But for Kira, watching from her position in the formation, the evening felt like standing on the edge of a precipice where one wrong step would send everything tumbling into chaos. The corruption network had spent weeks positioning their pieces for this moment. Flynn's equipment had been compromised with surgical precision, his route assignments carefully selected to maximize isolation and vulnerability. His team composition arranged to ensure he would have minimal support when the engineered failures began manifesting. Even the weather forecast had been manipulated. Rodriguez had access to meteorological systems that allowed him to provide false information about storm patterns, ensuring that rescue operations would be delayed when Flynn's accident occurred. As recruits loaded onto transport vehicles that would carry them to the wilderness insertion points, Kira made her final preparations for what was about to unfold. Her personal gear contained items that weren't issued to standard recruits. Emergency medical supplies that went far beyond basic first aid, communication equipment that could reach frequencies normal military radios couldn't access, and tools that would allow her to conduct rescue operations in conditions that would stop conventional efforts cold. She had also prepared contingency plans for multiple scenarios, from subtle intervention that might preserve her cover to full exposure operations that would sacrifice her mission to save Flynn's life. The optimal solution would involve preventing the network's assassination attempt without revealing her true capabilities. But she understood that optimal solutions weren't always available in tactical environments. The transport convoy departed Ironwall Academy at 1900 hours, winding through mountain roads that became progressively more treacherous as they climbed toward the wilderness training area. Kira sat in the back of the lead vehicle, surrounded by recruits who were processing their nervousness through forced bravado and gallows humor. Flynn occupied a seat near the front, isolated from the conversations around him by weeks of systematic social manipulation that had convinced everyone he was a liability they couldn't afford to associate with. Voss controlled the informal leadership of their transport, his voice carrying over the engine noise as he provided commentary on the terrain they were passing through and predictions about the challenges they would face. His observations were tactically sound and professionally delivered, reinforcing his position as someone others looked to for guidance while subtly emphasizing Flynn's exclusion from the group dynamic. Navigation is going to be the critical factor, Voss explained to his audience of eager listeners. The terrain channelizes movement patterns, which means wrong turns can add hours to transit times. People who can't maintain pace with their teams are going to find themselves alone in conditions where alone means dead. It was exactly the kind of professional analysis that instructors wanted to hear from emerging leaders, while also serving as a coded threat directed at Flynn. Everyone understood who was most likely to fall behind and become isolated, just as everyone understood that expressing concern for struggling team members would mark them as potential targets for similar treatment. The insertion point was a clearing carved from dense forest, surrounded by peaks that disappeared into low-hanging clouds pregnant with the storm systems that would arrive within hours. As recruits disembarked and formed up for final briefings, the temperature had already begun dropping toward the freezing point that would make survival a serious concern for anyone caught exposed without proper shelter. Senior Instructor Walsh conducted the operational briefing with the kind of professional competence that had made him effective at concealing his true agenda. The exercise parameters were clearly explained: safety protocols thoroughly reviewed, and emergency procedures carefully detailed. To anyone unfamiliar with the network's objectives, it appeared to be exactly the kind of comprehensive preparation that ensured training remained challenging while maintaining reasonable safety margins. But Kira understood the subtle modifications that had been introduced. Communication check intervals had been extended beyond standard safety protocols, creating windows of time when missing personnel might not be immediately noticed. Route assignments had been adjusted to ensure Flynn would be traversing the most dangerous terrain during weather conditions that would maximize his vulnerability. Most critically, rescue response procedures had been altered in ways that would delay assistance if emergency situations developed. Flynn received his route assignment and studied the map coordinates with the kind of intense concentration that suggested he understood this exercise represented a critical test of his worthiness to continue in the program. His assigned path would take him through a section of terrain known locally as the Devil's Backbone, a series of narrow ridges connected by exposed traverses where equipment failures could easily result in fatal falls. Under normal circumstances, recruits attempting such routes would be paired with experienced climbing partners and provided with redundant safety systems. Flynn's assignment included neither accommodation. He would be attempting some of the most technically challenging terrain in the training area with compromised equipment and no backup support, during weather conditions that would reduce visibility and increase the likelihood of navigation errors. As teams departed for their individual insertion points, Kira found herself assigned to a route that paralleled Flynn's path, while maintaining enough distance to preserve the illusion that she wasn't conducting surveillance. It was a perfect positioning that suggested someone in the network understood her true mission and was deliberately placing her where she could witness Flynn's elimination without being able to intervene effectively. The realization that her cover had been compromised changed everything. If the network knew she was more than a struggling logistics recruit, then they also knew her intervention capabilities posed a threat to their operational security. They weren't just planning to eliminate Flynn, they were planning to eliminate both targets simultaneously, using the isolation and harsh conditions of the wilderness exercise to ensure neither would survive to compromise their activities. Kira's communication gear crackled with the final coordination signals as teams moved toward their starting positions. Within 30 minutes, 47 recruits would be scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of hostile terrain, operating under conditions that would make it nearly impossible to distinguish between legitimate training accidents and deliberate murder. The network had chosen their killing ground with expert precision, creating circumstances where multiple deaths could be explained as the tragic but inevitable result of training that pushed recruits beyond their limits. As she moved through the forest toward her designated starting position, Kira conducted final preparations for what was about to unfold. Her equipment was checked and rechecked, her route memorized in detail that would allow navigation even under extreme weather conditions, her communication protocols tested to ensure she could reach external support if extraction became necessary. But most importantly, she made the psychological transition from covert observer to active combatant. For weeks, she had been Kira Ashford, unremarkable recruit trying to prove herself worthy of elite military service. That persona had served its purpose, but it was about to become a liability in an environment where survival would require capabilities that no logistics coordinator should possess. The storm arrived ahead of schedule, bringing with it wind speeds that turned simple movement into a struggle against natural forces that seemed determined to strip away any pretense of human control. Visibility dropped to mere meters, navigation became an exercise in dead reckoning, and the temperature plummeted toward levels that would make exposure fatal within hours for anyone caught without proper shelter. perfect conditions for murder disguised as training accidents. Flynn's position beacon showed him moving steadily along his assigned route, maintaining the kind of measured pace that suggested he was managing the challenging conditions with appropriate caution. But Kira's enhanced monitoring equipment revealed irregularities in his progress that indicated his compromised gear was already beginning to fail. His communication attempts were becoming increasingly erratic. His GPS readings were showing the kind of drift that suggested electronic interference, and his movement patterns indicated he was struggling with equipment malfunctions that were degrading his capability to maintain safe progress through dangerous terrain. The network's plan was unfolding with mechanical precision. Flynn was being systematically isolated and degraded while advancing toward the terrain features that would make his elimination appear accidental. In approximately 2 hours, he would reach the section of the Devil's Backbone where his compromised climbing gear would fail catastrophically, sending him to his death in a fall that would be ruled a training accident by investigators who wouldn't understand the sophisticated preparation that had made it inevitable. Unless someone intervened with capabilities that would reveal everything the network thought they knew about quiet logistics recruits was completely wrong. Kira began moving toward Flynn's position with speed and precision that would have been impossible for someone with her supposed background. She was no longer pretending to be anything other than exactly what she was, a predator moving through hostile terrain to intercept other predators who had made the fatal mistake of threatening someone under her protection. The weekend exercise was about to become something none of them had anticipated, and by the time it ended, everyone involved would understand that some people were far more dangerous than they appeared, especially when they finally stopped pretending to be harmless. The Devil's Backbone earned its name from the skeletal ridge of granite that jutted from the mountainside like vertebrae of some ancient beast, connected by narrow traverses that dropped into darkness on both sides. In daylight with clear weather, it represented a challenging but manageable climbing route that tested technical skills without requiring extraordinary capability. In the storm conditions that now engulfed the mountain, it had become a death trap that would challenge even expert climbers operating with perfect equipment. Flynn reached the base of the first traverse at 2147 hours, his progress slowed by equipment failures that had been escalating throughout his movement toward the target area. His headlamp flickered intermittently due to battery drainage that shouldn't have occurred for hours. His GPS unit displayed readings that placed him in locations he knew were incorrect, and his climbing harness had developed stress points that were invisible in the darkness but would fail catastrophically under load. The network's planning had been flawless. Every piece of compromised equipment was failing on schedule, degrading Flynn's capabilities in a progression that would culminate in his death during the most technically demanding section of his route. Even if he recognized that his gear had been sabotaged, he had no alternatives available and no communication capability to request assistance or abort the exercise. From her concealed position 300 meters away, Kira tracked his movements through night vision equipment that revealed the full scope of his deteriorating situation. Flynn was climbing with the kind of careful precision that demonstrated proper training and sound judgment, but he was doing so with gear that had been systematically weakened to ensure failure at critical moments. His carabiners would snap under stress loads they were rated to handle easily, his rope would part during falls that should have been routine arrests, and his harness would separate during rappel operations that represented standard climbing procedures. She could also see the other elements of the network's operation moving into position. Voss had deviated from his assigned route and was approaching the area from the north, carrying equipment that wasn't part of standard recruit loadouts. Walsh had appeared at an observation point that provided clear sightlines to the traverse area, positioning himself where he could monitor the elimination while maintaining plausible deniability about his presence. Most significantly, Rodriguez was moving along a parallel ridge with what appeared to be communication jamming equipment that would prevent any distress signals from reaching rescue coordination centers. The assassination was being conducted with military precision by people who understood how to coordinate complex operations while maintaining multiple layers of operational security. If Kira hadn't identified the network and positioned herself to intervene, Flynn's death would have appeared to be exactly what they intended: a training accident involving a struggling recruit who had pushed beyond his capabilities during challenging conditions. At 2203 hours, Flynn began the first technical traverse, a 30-meter crossing that required precise footwork and confident use of protection systems. Under normal circumstances, the route was well within his demonstrated capabilities. With compromised equipment during storm conditions, it became an execution method disguised as a climbing challenge. 20 meters into the traverse, his primary carabiner failed. The failure occurred exactly as the network had calculated, during a routine protection placement that should have been completely safe. Flynn's weight shifted to his backup system just as his main attachment point separated, creating the kind of equipment cascade that would result in an uncontrolled fall into the darkness below. The failure was so sudden and unexpected that even an expert climber would have struggled to respond effectively. But Flynn managed to arrest his slide using emergency techniques that demonstrated both excellent training and remarkable presence of mind under extreme stress. Instead of panicking when his primary safety systems failed, he executed a controlled conversion to his secondary protection and managed to establish a stable position on a narrow ledge that provided temporary security. It was an impressive display of technical skill and mental toughness that should have been celebrated as exactly the kind of performance the Academy wanted to develop. Instead, it meant he had survived the first elimination attempt, which would trigger escalation to more direct methods. Kira watched Voss begin moving toward Flynn's position with equipment that included climbing gear rated for rescue operations. To anyone observing casually, it would appear that Voss was responding to distress signals by positioning himself to provide assistance if needed. In reality, he was moving to ensure that Flynn's second accident would be fatal, either through direct action or by sabotaging any successful self-rescue attempts. The moment for subtle intervention had passed. Flynn was trapped on a ledge with failing equipment, surrounded by people who were actively trying to kill him during weather conditions that would prevent conventional rescue operations. Saving his life would require capabilities that no logistics coordinator should possess, which meant exposing herself in ways that would compromise years of careful preparation for future missions. Kira moved. Her progression down the cliff face toward Flynn's position demonstrated climbing skills that belonged to someone with extensive mountaineering experience in hostile environments. She descended through terrain that would have challenged expert climbers, using techniques that minimized exposure time while maintaining security margins that ensured she could reach Flynn before Voss completed his approach from the opposite direction. Flynn's position on the narrow ledge was precarious but stable, his emergency anchor points properly constructed despite the equipment failures that had created the crisis. When Kira appeared above him in the darkness, rappelling down the cliff face with the kind of controlled precision that indicated expert training, his expression shifted from relief to confusion as he processed what he was seeing. "Ashford," he called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "What are you doing here? This isn't your assigned route." "Your route intersected with mine," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact as she established her own protection systems and began assessing his situation. "Looks like you're having equipment problems." The explanation was thin enough to be obviously false, but Flynn was too focused on survival to question the logic of her presence. She began transferring protection gear to replace his compromised equipment, her movements demonstrating familiarity with technical rescue procedures that went far beyond anything taught in basic military training. "Where did you learn to climb like this?" Flynn asked as she completed the equipment transfer with expert efficiency. "Required training for logistics work in mountainous regions," Kira replied, continuing to maintain her cover story even as her actions made it increasingly implausible. Supply routes sometimes go through challenging terrain. Above them, Voss had reached a position where he could observe their interaction while remaining concealed from their direct view. His original plan had been to ensure Flynn's elimination through equipment failure or direct action disguised as rescue attempts. The presence of another recruit in the area represented a complication that required adaptation, but it also provided an opportunity to eliminate both targets simultaneously if handled properly. Kira was aware of Voss's position and understood that her intervention had escalated the situation beyond the network's original parameters. They would now have to choose between aborting the operation or expanding it to include her elimination, which would require more direct methods that carried greater risk of exposure. As she completed Flynn's equipment restoration and began preparations for extraction from his compromised position, she also initiated subtle signals that would alert her external support systems to prepare for emergency extraction if the situation deteriorated further. The network had demonstrated capabilities that suggested they possessed resources beyond what she had initially assessed, which meant her own backup systems might be necessary to ensure both Flynn's survival and her own mission continuity. But first, they had to survive the next 30 minutes, during which Voss would be forced to make decisions about how far the network was willing to go to protect their operational security. Those decisions would determine whether the night ended with successful rescue operations or with the kind of violence that would expose everything they had worked to conceal. High above them, Walsh spoke quietly into a communication device that connected him to coordination elements outside the immediate area. The conversation was brief but decisive, and when it concluded, he signaled Voss to proceed with direct action authorization. The network had decided that maintaining operational security was worth the risk of expanding their elimination parameters. Both Flynn and the logistics recruit, who had interfered with their operation, would be eliminated tonight using methods that would ensure neither survived to compromise ongoing activities. But they had made one critical error in their threat assessment. The quiet recruit who had spent weeks being invisible wasn't actually a logistics coordinator with basic climbing skills. She was something far more dangerous, and she had been waiting for exactly this moment to demonstrate why underestimating the invisible ones was a mistake that could prove fatal. The storm continued to rage around them, providing perfect cover for the violence that was about to unfold on the Devil's Backbone. The sound of Voss's approach came as a subtle displacement of loose stone, barely audible over the storm but unmistakable to someone trained to recognize human movement in hostile environments. Kira's head turned fractionally toward the sound, her body language shifting in ways that Flynn couldn't interpret but that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with combat experience. She was transitioning from rescue operations to threat assessment, her movements becoming more deliberate and economical as she prepared for contact with hostile forces. "Stay exactly where you are," she told Flynn, her voice carrying a tone of absolute authority that seemed completely at odds with the struggling logistics recruit he thought he knew. "Don't move, don't speak, and don't try to help regardless of what happens next." Flynn opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but the expression on her face stopped him cold. In the flickering illumination from their headlamps, Her features had transformed into something he had never seen before. The hesitancy and uncertainty that had characterized her behavior for weeks had vanished, replaced by the kind of predatory focus that belonged to someone accustomed to violence in ways that went far beyond military training exercises. Voss emerged from the darkness above them with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the tactical situation. His climbing gear was clearly superior to standard recruit equipment, and his movement down the cliff face demonstrated technical skills that exceeded anything he should have possessed based on his official background. When he spoke, his voice carried the casual authority of someone addressing subordinates rather than offering assistance to fellow recruits in distress. "Well, this is an interesting development," he said, establishing a stable position approximately 10 meters above their ledge. "Flynn, I have to admit I'm impressed. Most people would have fallen to their deaths when their equipment failed like that. It takes real skill to recover from that kind of cascade failure." The compliment was delivered with the kind of false warmth that made Flynn's stomach tighten with recognition of danger he couldn't fully comprehend. There was something fundamentally wrong with Voss's presence here, something that went beyond coincidental route intersection or helpful teammate response to emergency situations. "How did you know about the equipment failure?" Kira asked, her question cutting through Voss's performance with surgical precision. "Flynn never transmitted a distress signal, and his position isn't visible from any standard route assignments." Voss's expression flickered momentarily as he processed the implications of her observation. She had identified inconsistencies in his cover story that suggested intelligence analysis capabilities that exceeded anything a logistics recruit should possess. His response options were narrowing rapidly toward direct action solutions that would eliminate both witnesses to his activities. "I've been monitoring all team communications since the weather deteriorated," he replied, his tone becoming more guarded. "Basic leadership responsibility to track struggling team members." "Flynn's communications equipment failed 30 minutes ago," Kira continued, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone, while her body position shifted in subtle ways that prepared her for immediate action. "Complete radio silence since 2130 hours, so either you're monitoring systems that don't exist, or you're here for reasons that have nothing to do with rescue operations." The exchange had moved beyond verbal sparring into territory where Voss would be forced to choose between abandoning his mission or revealing capabilities that would expose the network's activities. From his position above them, he possessed significant tactical advantages in terms of positioning and equipment. But Kira's questions had demonstrated that she understood far more about the situation than her cover identity should have allowed, which meant she represented a threat to operational security that required immediate neutralization. "You know what, Ashford?" Voss said, his voice losing all pretense of friendly concern. "You ask too many questions for someone who's supposed to be counting inventory in supply warehouses." His movement was smooth and professional as he began descending toward their position, but it carried the unmistakable intent of someone approaching to eliminate threats rather than provide assistance. Flynn pressed himself against the rock face, his mind struggling to process what was happening, while his body responded to survival instincts that recognized imminent danger. Kira met Voss's approach with movements that belonged to someone with extensive close-quarters combat training in mountaineering environments. Instead of retreating or attempting to avoid confrontation, she positioned herself to intercept his descent while maintaining anchor points that would prevent her from being dislodged from the cliff face. Her actions demonstrated tactical thinking that went far beyond anything taught in basic military training. When Voss reached a position where he could attempt to sabotage their protection systems or initiate direct physical confrontation, Kira moved with speed and precision, that redefined Flynn's understanding of human capability under extreme conditions. Her response wasn't the desperate flailing of someone fighting for survival. It was the controlled application of lethal force by someone trained to operate in environments where hesitation meant death. The engagement lasted less than 15 seconds. Voss's superior equipment and positioning advantages became irrelevant when confronted by someone whose technical skills in vertical combat situations exceeded anything he had encountered before. Kira's movements demonstrated mastery of techniques that belonged to specialized military units that operated in mountainous terrain, combined with close-quarters combat training that allowed her to neutralize opponents while maintaining security on technical climbing routes. The sound of Voss's impact with the rocks below was lost in the storm, but the sudden absence of his voice in the darkness above them created a silence that was somehow more profound than the wind howling through the peaks. Flynn stared at Kira in shock, his mind trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he thought he knew about the quiet recruit who had kept to herself for weeks. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the relative quiet that followed the confrontation. Kira was already moving, her actions focused on establishing secure extraction routes, rather than providing explanations for what had just occurred. Her climbing techniques continued to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded anything possible for someone with her supposed background, and her equipment included items that weren't part of standard recruit loadouts. "Right now I'm someone trying to keep you alive," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact as she prepared rope systems for rapid descent to terrain where conventional rescue operations would be possible. "Questions about my background can wait until we're somewhere that won't kill us if we lose focus." Above them, Walsh's voice crackled through communication equipment that had somehow remained functional despite the jamming operations Rodriguez had initiated. The conversation was brief and coded, but Flynn caught enough fragments to understand that additional personnel were being directed toward their location. Whatever had happened here was expanding beyond the scope of anything that could be dismissed as training accidents. "We need to move immediately," Kira announced, her assessment of their tactical situation complete. "This location is compromised, and staying here means additional contact with hostile forces that we're not positioned to handle effectively." Flynn wanted to ask about her use of terms like hostile forces and tactical situation that seemed completely inappropriate for describing conflicts between fellow recruits during training exercises, but her movements carried the kind of urgency that suggested immediate action was more important than understanding, and his own survival instincts were screaming that trusting her judgment was his only viable option. As they began descending toward terrain that would allow extraction from the immediate danger area, Flynn realized that his entire understanding of the situation at Ironwall Academy had been fundamentally wrong. The harassment he had experienced wasn't the result of personality conflicts or training stress. The equipment failures that had nearly killed him weren't accidents or manufacturing defects, and the quiet recruit who had just saved his life wasn't anything close to what she had appeared to be. The questions multiplied faster than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. He had been targeted for elimination by people who possessed capabilities and resources that went far beyond what should have been available to fellow recruits or even instructional staff. And the person who had intervened to save him was operating on a level that suggested involvement in activities that existed far outside the normal scope of military training operations. As they reached terrain where rapid movement toward extraction points became possible, Kira activated communication equipment that connected her to external coordination elements Flynn hadn't known existed. Her conversation was brief and professional, using terminology that belonged to intelligence operations rather than training exercises. "Phantom to control," she said, her voice carrying easily despite the storm conditions. "Package is secure, but operational parameters have been compromised. Request immediate extraction with full tactical support. We have multiple hostile elements in the area, and limited time before situation escalates beyond current containment capabilities." Flynn's world shifted fundamentally as he processed what he had just heard. The logistics recruit who had saved his life wasn't named Kira Ashford, and she certainly wasn't someone who had spent years managing inventory in supply warehouses. She was something else entirely, something that operated in shadows he hadn't known existed, and somehow his survival had become important enough to justify exposing operational capabilities that were obviously meant to remain secret. The extraction helicopter materialized from the storm like something conjured from military necessity, its rotors cutting through wind and sleet with the kind of precision that suggested pilots accustomed to operating in conditions that would ground conventional aircraft. Flynn watched in stunned silence as the aircraft established a hover pattern over terrain that shouldn't have been accessible to anything larger than emergency medical helicopters, its sophisticated navigation systems allowing pinpoint positioning despite weather that had reduced visibility to nearly zero. The insertion of tactical personnel happened with choreographed efficiency that belonged to units trained for high-risk operations in hostile environments. 4 operators fast-roped to the ground, with equipment loads that exceeded anything Flynn had seen during his infantry training, their movements coordinated through communication systems that allowed seamless integration despite the challenging conditions. When they established a perimeter around the extraction zone, their positioning demonstrated familiarity with terrain that suggested extensive prior reconnaissance. "Package secure," reported the team leader, a compact woman whose voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of operational experience in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. "Area is clear of immediate threats, but we have multiple signatures moving toward this location from the north and east. Estimate 12 to 15 minutes before contact." Kira acknowledged the report with professional brevity that confirmed Flynn's growing understanding that he had stumbled into operations that existed far outside the scope of normal military training. Her communication with the extraction team used terminology and protocols that belonged to specialized units conducting classified missions rather than rescue operations for training accidents. As medical personnel began examining Flynn for injuries sustained during his ordeal on the Devil's Backbone, he found himself surrounded by people whose equipment and procedures exceeded anything he had encountered during his previous military service. Their gear included medical monitoring devices that provided real-time assessment of his physical condition, communication equipment that maintained connectivity despite the storm conditions, and weapons systems that suggested preparation for combat operations rather than simple extraction duties. "Sir, I need you to understand that everything you've witnessed tonight is classified at levels that require specific clearances," the team leader explained as medics completed their assessment. "Your immediate safety is our priority, but operational security considerations mean that detailed explanations will have to wait until we reach a secure facility." Flynn nodded his understanding while his mind continued processing the implications of what he was experiencing. The resources being dedicated to his extraction exceeded anything that would be justified for a single recruit in distress during a training exercise. The tactical coordination suggested preparation that went far beyond emergency response to equipment failures. Most significantly, the person he had known as Kira Ashford was being treated as someone whose safety justified risking multiple aircraft and specialized personnel during conditions that challenged even expert operators. During the helicopter ride to the secure facility, Flynn observed interactions between Kira and the extraction team that confirmed she possessed authority and operational experience that placed her far above his level in whatever hierarchy governed their activities. Her debrief was conducted using codes and references that he couldn't interpret, but the tone of the conversation suggested that his rescue had been secondary to protecting her identity and mission parameters. The secure facility turned out to be a complex carved into mountainside terrain, similar to Ironwall Academy, but equipped with technology that exceeded anything Flynn had seen in conventional military installations. His processing through arrival procedures included medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and security screening that suggested his access to the facility represented a significant deviation from normal operational protocols. Admiral Reeves arrived 3 hours after their extraction, his presence indicating that events at Ironwall Academy had attracted attention at command levels that Flynn hadn't realized existed. When the Admiral entered the briefing room where Flynn waited, his demeanor suggested someone dealing with crisis management that extended far beyond training, accidents, or recruit safety concerns. "Mr. Flynn," Admiral Reeves began, his tone carrying the weight of authority that came from decades of experience with situations where individual lives intersected with national security concerns. "What you experienced tonight represents the culmination of an investigation that has been ongoing for 18 months. Your survival is significant not just personally, but operationally, because you represent the first living witness to activities that have resulted in 3 deaths at Ironwall Academy." The revelation that his ordeal was connected to previous fatalities recontextualized everything Flynn thought he understood about his experience at the Academy. The harassment he had endured wasn't random hazing or personality conflicts. It was preparation for elimination conducted by people who had refined their methods through previous operations. His survival meant that patterns which had been invisible to conventional investigations could finally be documented and prosecuted. The person you knew as Kira Ashford is actually a specialized operator conducting deep cover intelligence operations, Admiral Reeves continued. Her mission was to identify and document the network responsible for systematically eliminating recruits who met specific psychological profiles. Your case represented the culmination of their selection and elimination process. Flynn's understanding of his situation shifted fundamentally as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. He hadn't been struggling with normal training challenges or personality conflicts with fellow recruits. He had been targeted for assassination by people who used military training environments as cover for systematic murder. His survival was the result of intervention by someone whose real job involved preventing exactly the kind of elimination he had been selected for. The network included instructional staff, administrative personnel, and recruit leadership positions, the Admiral explained. Their operations were sophisticated enough to avoid detection through normal oversight mechanisms, while ensuring that elimination targets appeared to fail due to personal inadequacy rather than external intervention. 3 previous recruits died during training exercises that were specifically engineered to ensure fatal outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability. The briefing continued with details that painted a picture of institutional corruption that exceeded anything Flynn could have imagined. Equipment sabotage, psychological warfare, coordination with external elements who had specific interests in eliminating certain recruits. All of it conducted under the cover of legitimate military training by people who had learned to weaponize the Academy's own systems against their intended beneficiaries. Your testimony will be critical to prosecution efforts, Admiral Reeves concluded, but more immediately, your survival represents validation that our intelligence operations can identify and prevent these activities when properly resourced and positioned. The operator who saved your life has been conducting similar missions in multiple locations where institutional corruption has created conditions for systematic elimination of vulnerable personnel. Flynn found himself struggling to process the scope of what he was learning. His personal ordeal was apparently one component of investigations that spanned multiple military installations and involved networks of corruption that reached levels he hadn't known existed. His survival had operational significance that extended far beyond his individual case. As the briefing concluded and Flynn was escorted to quarters where he could rest, while additional processing continued, he realized that his understanding of military service had been fundamentally naive. He had believed that institutional protections and professional standards would prevent the kind of systematic abuse he had experienced. Instead, he had discovered that those same institutions could be weaponized by people who understood how to exploit trust and authority for purposes that had nothing to do with military effectiveness. But he had also learned that there were people working within those systems whose job was to identify and stop exactly the kind of corruption that had nearly killed him. The quiet recruit he had barely noticed was actually part of a network of operators who worked in shadows to protect people who didn't know they needed protection. His survival meant that future recruits at Ironwall Academy would be safer, that the network responsible for 3 deaths would face prosecution, and that institutional reforms would prevent similar operations from succeeding in other locations. It was a significant victory achieved through the sacrifice of operational security by someone who had chosen his life over her continued effectiveness as a deep cover operator. As Flynn finally allowed exhaustion to claim him, his last conscious thought was recognition that he owed his survival to someone whose name he still didn't know, whose background remained classified, and whose future missions would take her to other locations where quiet strength would be needed to protect people who never realized they were in danger. The quiet ones, he had learned, were often the most dangerous, but they were also often the only ones standing between vulnerability and those who preyed upon it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Ironwall Academy parade ground as the remaining recruits assembled for what would be their final formation at the facility. The events of the weekend had fundamentally altered the trajectory of their training program, though most of them still didn't understand the full scope of what had unfolded in the mountains. Official announcements had been carefully worded to describe equipment failures and weather-related incidents, but the sudden departure of key personnel and the arrival of investigative teams had created an atmosphere of uncertainty that pervaded every aspect of Academy operations. Flynn stood in formation with his arm in a sling, the visible reminder of his ordeal serving as a focal point for questions that couldn't be answered through official channels. His fellow recruits had been told he survived a serious climbing accident during the weekend exercise, but the circumstances of his rescue and the subsequent activities at the academy suggested events far more complex than simple training mishaps. When other recruits approached him with questions about what had really happened, he could only respond that the details remained classified, pending ongoing investigations. The absence of Voss and several other recruits was explained through administrative transfers and medical withdrawals, but Flynn recognized the careful language that concealed more significant developments. He had learned enough during his debriefings to understand that arrests were being processed through channels that operated outside normal military justice procedures, suggesting investigations that involved national security implications rather than simple violations of Academy policies. Captain Torres stood before the formation with the bearing of someone whose professional world had been fundamentally challenged by revelations about activities he should have detected and prevented. His announcement that the current training cycle was being suspended pending comprehensive program review was delivered with the kind of professional composure that concealed personal recognition of systematic failures in leadership and oversight. Effective immediately, all current recruits will be transferred to alternative training facilities, where program completion will continue under modified protocols, Torres announced. The suspension of operations at Ironwall Academy reflects the need for comprehensive evaluation of institutional practices and safety procedures that have proven inadequate for ensuring recruit welfare. The careful phrasing acknowledged problems without revealing their true scope, maintaining operational security while providing enough information to justify the dramatic disruption of established training schedules. Flynn understood that he was witnessing the public face of an investigation that would remain classified for years, while its implications reshaped policies across multiple military institutions. As the formation dispersed and recruits began processing for transfer to their new assignments, Flynn found himself approached by Instructor Martinez, whose expression carried the weight of someone dealing with professional obligations that extended beyond her normal duties. Her conversation with him was brief but significant, acknowledging his survival while carefully avoiding details that remained classified. "You showed exceptional resilience during challenging conditions," she said, her words chosen to provide recognition while maintaining security protocols. "That kind of character under pressure indicates potential for significant contributions to military service, regardless of how your career develops from this point." The commendation was both genuine and carefully constructed to provide positive closure to his experience at Ironwall Academy without revealing the circumstances that had made such recognition necessary. Flynn understood that his official records would reflect successful completion of initial training requirements despite the program's suspension, ensuring that his future opportunities wouldn't be compromised by events beyond his control. Later that afternoon, as Flynn completed his final administrative processing, he was approached by a woman in civilian clothing whose identification indicated she represented the same command authority that had conducted his debriefings. Her presence at the academy suggested ongoing coordination between the investigation teams and personnel involved in his case. "Mr. Flynn," she began, her tone professional but carrying undertones that suggested personal interest in his welfare. "Your cooperation with our investigation has been invaluable for prosecution efforts and institutional reforms that will prevent future incidents. Your survival and testimony represent the difference between continued operation of criminal networks and their complete dismantlement." She paused, allowing him to process the significance of what she was saying before continuing. "The individual who saved your life will be receiving recognition appropriate to her contribution, though the nature of her work means that recognition will remain classified. I wanted you to know that your survival has operational significance that extends far beyond your personal case." Flynn nodded his understanding while recognizing that he would probably never learn the full scope of what had really happened during his time at Ironwall Academy. The person he had known as Kira Ashford had disappeared as completely as if she had never existed, her mission complete and her identity dissolved back into whatever shadows she had emerged from. He would carry questions about her true background and subsequent assignments for the rest of his career, but he also understood that some questions were destined to remain unanswered. The drive away from Ironwall Academy took Flynn through mountain terrain that looked completely different in daylight than it had during the storm conditions of his near-death experience. The peaks that had seemed so threatening and hostile now appeared merely challenging, the kind of environment where properly equipped and supported military personnel could operate effectively without facing manufactured dangers designed to ensure their elimination. His transfer orders directed him to a training facility in the Eastern Territories where program completion would continue under instructors who had been thoroughly vetted through security procedures that exceeded normal military standards. The assignment represented not just continuation of his military education, but validation that his survival had earned him opportunities to contribute to organizations whose missions he was only beginning to understand. As his transport vehicle descended toward the valley floor where his new assignment waited, Flynn reflected on lessons learned through experiences that had challenged every assumption he possessed about military service and institutional integrity. He had discovered that the systems designed to protect and develop military personnel could be weaponized by people whose objectives had nothing to do with national defense or individual development. But he had also learned that there were people working within those same systems whose mission was to identify and eliminate exactly the kind of corruption that had nearly killed him. They operated in shadows, using identities that dissolved when their work was complete, sacrificing recognition and normal career progression to ensure that others could serve without facing dangers that had nothing to do with legitimate military risks. The quiet ones he had discovered carried burdens that most people never recognized or appreciated. They made sacrifices that remained invisible while ensuring that institutions functioned according to their intended purposes rather than being subverted by those who sought to exploit trust and authority for criminal objectives. 6 months later, Flynn graduated from his alternative training program with distinctions that reflected both his technical competence and his demonstrated character under extreme pressure. His assignment to a specialized unit conducting operations in challenging environments carried recognition that his experience had prepared him for responsibilities that required exceptional resilience and judgment. He never saw the person he had known as Kira Ashford again, though he occasionally wondered whether other quiet individuals in his various assignments might be conducting similar missions under equally sophisticated cover identities. The possibility that invisible guardians might be operating in any environment where institutional corruption could threaten vulnerable personnel became a source of comfort rather than paranoia. If you've ever encountered someone who worked without recognition, who carried responsibilities that others couldn't see, who protected people who never realized they needed protection, take a moment to acknowledge their contribution. The world contains more such people than most realize, operating in shadows because their effectiveness depends on remaining invisible until the moment when visibility becomes necessary to prevent tragedy. They don't seek recognition because recognition would compromise their ability to continue their work. They don't expect gratitude because gratitude would acknowledge the existence of dangers that most people prefer not to contemplate. They simply do what needs to be done when it needs to be done because someone must shoulder the responsibility of ensuring that trust and vulnerability aren't exploited by those who see them as opportunities rather than sacred obligations. The quiet strength that operates in shadows deserves recognition, even if that recognition must remain as invisible as the people who demonstrate it. Their sacrifice ensures that institutions can function according to their highest purposes, rather than being corrupted by those who would use them for objectives that have nothing to do with service or protection. If this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of quiet guardians in your own experience, share that recognition. The invisible ones may never seek acknowledgement, but they deserve to know that their sacrifice has meaning beyond the immediate lives they save and the immediate corruption they prevent. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never be known, whose victories will never be celebrated, whose service will never be acknowledged, except in the safety and security that others take for granted. They are the ones who ensure that trust remains trustworthy, that protection remains protective, and that the quiet ones among us can remain quiet without becoming targets. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.